Okay, perfect. Good morning. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, sorry. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. I think we are on live. If anything goes wrong, you know that I can read your message on the YouTube and also on the WhatsApp. So let me know if we are having some difficulties, okay? Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Welcome to this live talk by the research group of CogniMath. Is the last talk of this first chapter or season of series of talks that we will have. I appreciate your support for all the activities we have carried out in the group. All these activities are for you, and I'm very proud of my students. Without you, this will not be possible. The cognitive group is close to completing 5 years in August. And today's talk is very special to me. So I thank Dr. Francesca Capozzi infinitely for her kindness and for having accepted this invitation. So Dr. Francesca is at a university that I have a special place in my heart, that is the McGill University. It was at McGill that the dream of having a working group and generating a custom research and outreach activities was born. So walking around the McGill campus is one of the best things that happened in my life. It's an honor for us to have Dr. Francesca Capozzi for this talk. So let me introduce our guest today by mentioning some aspects of her career. So Dr. Francesca Capozzi is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Psychology at McGill University at the Attention and Social Cognition Lab. She earned her PhD in neuroscience at the University of Torino in Italy. Her MS, her master's degree in the University of Torino, and her BS at the University of Napoli Federico II. She had a lot of experience. She had a lot of honors. One of them that I found amazing is the Vanier Banting Postdoctoral Fellowship. That is a very prestigious postdoctoral position in Canada.
No, that's not correct. Sorry,
Okay.
I was just selected at university level. Unfortunately, I didn't make it through. But yeah, I went close. I went very close.
Okay, but it's amazing. Also, the best paper nomination in the Italian Association. Sorry, and
It's
also
okay.
a lot of fellowships and grants, research papers. And today talk is going to be, I think, it's amazing to have her here. So, Francesca, thank you very much for this great opportunity. How is everything in my beloved Montreal, McGill? So
Everything
the
is
stage
good.
is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me try to share the screen again. Entire screen, allow, and should be good. Okay.
Yeah, it's good.
So, can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see it. Go
That's
ahead.
great. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm super happy to be here. Today, I'll try to walk you through some of the work I've been doing in the last few years to investigate social attention in multi-agent social context. That is, situations where we encounter more than a single other agent, like small groups, team meetings, family dinners, or larger crowded contexts. So let me start by explaining you what I study and how I got here. The studies of today, the studies I will present today are not in a chronological order. I decided to arrange them in a more conceptual order to go from relatively simple lab computerized tasks to how we can study actual interactive group scenarios. But still, I wanted to start with a bit of history to my background to make you understand what are the challenges I've been facing during my research. So, when I started my PhD in 2012, I'd say that the revolution of social cognition had already settled down. Around the years 2000, it started, and maybe again it exploded perhaps between the years 2006 and 2009. Well, this revolution was bringing the intuition that cognitive processes do not operate in isolation, but often in interactions, social interactions. So this emerging area of research started asking what are the cognitive processes that modulate, enable, support social interactions with others. And here again is the idea of this revolution of social cognition. But when I started in 2012, this revolution had already just settled down, as I was mentioning, and you could find easily all sorts of papers in many areas of the cognitive sciences, for example, joint action, and more specifically to my research interest, social attention, that is how visual attention responds to social stimuli in the environment. And all these papers were somehow conveying the idea that when you meet another person, you can't help but having certain cognitive responses. For example, you're walking on a street and you see this guy, like in this picture, there is looking at something, maybe he's looking at an insect, maybe nothing, maybe something interesting. However, the idea that the papers in my area at the time were conveying is that you can't help but look where he's looking, or orient your attention where he's looking at, to find out what is that he's looking at. We call this gaze following behavior. It's a very basic, important process in social attention. I'll talk about it more in the next few slides. And again, these papers were conveying the idea that somehow this gaze following reaction is spontaneous, quick, and almost reflexive, automatic. That's all good. It's something that we can easily understand and perhaps even find reasonable. However, at the beginning of my PhD, I started asking what happens instead in this type of context. I act as one of my greatest passions. I go often to art museums, and here you can encounter multiple people, and they're often looking in different directions. For example, they're looking at different artworks. What happens to gaze following here? Do you follow spontaneously the gaze of all the people that are present, looking in so many different directions? And again, when I started my PhD, I asked myself this type of question. I looked for an answer in the literature at the time, and I did not find any. So I decided to devote the next 10 years of my research to find an answer to this type of question. Primarily, for example, how basic social cognitive processes change from dyadic to more complex multi-agent scenarios like the one presented in this picture. And this is what I will talk about today. Specifically, my plan for today is divided in 3 parts. I'll divide the talk in 3 main parts. In the first one, I will try to address this general question of how certain cognitive processes change from dyadic to multi-agent settings. Then I will move forward to see how we can approach more interactive group interactions to predict, for example, individual group members' behaviors. And then finally, I will try to address some of my works in which I was interested in investigating how social attention during group interaction can reflect social dynamics during the group interaction itself. So let's start with this relatively basic question. What does it change to perceive from perceiving one gaze direction to perceiving multiple gaze directions? And most importantly, how do we answer this question? So again, one phenomenon that is well studied in social attention is gaze following. The idea that when we meet someone else, we will spontaneously follow their gaze to look or attend to where they're looking at. How do we investigate gaze following in a lab task, a computerized lab task that, as you know, are very popular in cognitive research? Well, there is this well-established task called the gaze cueing task, and I will go through this in explaining how it works. And I'm sorry if you already know it, and in general, I'm sorry if during this presentation I will explain things that maybe you already know, but just bear with me for a little while. So again, this is a computerized task. The gray square represents the schematics of a computer screen. Participants are sitting in front of the computer screen, and the first thing they see is a fixation cross, inviting them to maintain their fixation on the cross, more or less at the center of the screen. Then a phase appears for 1,500 milliseconds, and this phase is looking straight ahead, like if they're looking at the participant. Then the phase shift their gaze towards left or right. They can shift their head, like in this example, or just their eyes. It doesn't really change. And it does so for a short period of time, 200 milliseconds, for example, or longer times like 700, 1000 milliseconds. And then finally, a response target appears. Participants were instructed to maintain fixation at the center, ignore the gaze shift, and just respond as quickly as possible to the appearing target, in this case, in this example, a letter, just by pressing a button. Critically, however, the target can appear either in the looked at direction, that is like in this example here, that it appears in the direction where the stimulus phase is looking at, and we call this a valid target or a cued target. But it can also appear in the opposite, not looked at direction, and we call this invalid, uncued target. This is the schematic representation, a made-up representation of the typical findings of this type of task. The red bar represents the response times to uncued, not looked at targets, and the green bar represents the response times to cued, looked at targets. You can see that typically reaction times to uncued targets are much slower than responses to cued targets, with this difference that we call magnitude of gaze following, going up to 10-20 milliseconds very typically, but I've seen also cases of 30 milliseconds that in terms of cognitive processes is actually an eternity. This is, again, a very well-established task. These results have been replicated countless times. I've been replicating them myself many times. So this is how we can investigate gaze following or typical gaze following in lab-based tasks. How can we use this task to start approaching questions relevant to multi-agent settings? Well, a very easy way I've done this was just wondering whether, multiple gaze cues somehow counted more than a single gaze cue. To ask this question, in 2015, a paper I published in PBR, I addressed what we call liking effect. I believe a liking effect was discovered by Andrew Bayliss in 2006, and it's a very simple but elegant idea. They used the gaze cueing task I just presented, and then they asked participants to rate how they liked the target objects. For example, the green cap in the picture above, or the blue-purple cap in the picture below. And they discovered that looked at targets, so targets that are consistently looked at by the stimulus phases, is also liked more than the looked away targets, the targets that are consistently not looked at. As one of my first questions in the realm of multi-agent settings, I was wondering if multiple people looking at the target objects would make a difference in this liking effect, for example. So I adapted this paradigm to have some target objects consistently looked at by multiple phases, and other target objects consistently looked at by a single phase. I didn't present all multiple phases together, always a single phase on the screen, but the association target phase was manipulated such that, again, some targets were consistently looked at by multiple people. Here are very quickly the results. I replicated the main findings of the liking effect. Cued targets are typically liked more than uncued targets, but only in this case when they're looked at by multiple people and not when they're consistently looked at by a single person. Again, this was a very simple, easy way to adapt a well-established lab task to investigate, to start approaching the question of multi-agent settings. And this data show that the more increased gaze directions also increase the perceived relevance of the social information around us. If someone is looking at an object, maybe that object is interesting, but even more so if it's looked at by multiple people. When evaluating this object ourselves, we implicitly take this information in account. And this, of course, modifies our own perception of liking about these objects. Sorry. So again, one first example on how to approach multi-agent social settings. However, let's turn to more directly to the question of how these basic cognitive processes, like for example, gaze following, change in multi-agent social settings. Again, multi-agent social settings are characterized by the fact that multiple people are present and might be looking in different directions. So I adapted the gaze cueing paradigm I modified it into a group cueing paradigm, that's how I call it. At the beginning, again, we have this fixation cross, then three faces appear on the screen, they're looking at a central object in front of them. After a while, they will shift their gaze towards one of the lateral objects. In this example, one face shifts their gaze towards the object on the left, and the other two faces towards the object on the right. Again, however, participants are instructed to ignore the gaze shifts, maintain fixation on the central object, and just quickly respond as quickly as possible with a button press to the appearing target, in this case, the letter H. In this example, one face was looking at an object and the other two faces are looking at another object. However, in this paradigm, all faces could also shift the gaze together toward the same object. This means that the target could, for example, be cued by 0 faces if all 3 faces are looking at a certain object, but the target appears on the opposite object. However, the target can also be cued by 1 face, like in this example, by 2 faces, or by all 3 faces, again representing the case where the faces are all 3 looking towards a certain object where the target will then appear. Let's take a look at the results. These are the reaction times to the target. And as you can see, and as maybe we could expect, the slowest reaction times happen when 0 faces are cueing the target, the first dot on the graph. On the contrary, the fastest reaction times happen when all 3 faces are cueing the target, the last 4th dot on the graph. And possibly this is something that we could have expected, and this substantially replicates the entire idea of gaze following. However, it's interesting to note what happens in the 2 central slides. Here you can see that when one face is cueing the target, there is a sensible, significant decrease in reaction times, meaning that one face cueing the target, 1 face out of 3, is already sufficient to facilitate the participants' responses to target, meaning that they already follow the gaze direction of a single individual, at least in the context of 3 people. Would this change if we increase the group size? 1 face out of 3 is perceived as relevant, or at least sufficiently relevant to be followed and therefore facilitate response to targets. But would 1 face out of 5, for example, would still be perceived as relevant? Here we can make 2 types of prediction. One is that, yes, 1 out of 5 face would be perceived as relevant and would be followed, thus facilitating responses to targets. In this case, a graph with 5 faces would look very similar to this one. However, another prediction is that 1 face out of 5 is not perceived as relevant because with the more stimulus faces, a bigger proportion of gaze directions is now perceived as relevant. This is what we asked in the second experiment of this paper. It's published that I published in 2018 on PBR again. And the data confirmed the second prediction. You can see that again, fastest reaction times when 5 phases are queuing the target, slowest reaction times when 0 phases are queuing the target. However, you can see that there is not much of difference between 1 phase queuing the target and 0 phases queuing the target. And the difference is still pretty absent when 2 phases are queuing the target. The first sensitive decrease in reaction times, and therefore the first sensitive significant facilitation in responses happens when 3 phases are queuing the target. Overall, this data suggests that, again, in the context of when we observe 3 people, a group of 3 people, 1 phase out of 3 is perceived as relevant, their gaze is followed, and therefore their gaze facilitates responses. However, this proportion of relevant information changes with increased group sizes. And now 3 phases, the gaze direction of 3 people is perceived as relevant and no longer the gaze direction of a single individual. So let me close on this first part of the talk. Just by using this relatively simple lab-based computerized task, we can already appreciate that human cognition possesses sophisticated characteristics that possess numerosity. Numerosity by itself makes a difference, impacts our cognitive processes. And specifically, we have already seen that just numerosity, increased group size, increases perceived relevance of social information. The more people, the more interesting. And as we've seen, for example, for the liking effect. But also in the last study I've been showing, we understand that increased group sizes require a dynamic adaptation of attentional responses to allow a better navigation of these more complex social scenarios. And specifically, what we've seen that the increasing the group size modifies, changes dynamically the proportion of social information that is perceived as relevant, at least in case of divergent gaze directions. Can we use these tasks to move a little bit forward and approach, for example, more interactive group scenarios? Yes, we can. One way in which we can do that is, for example, to integrate these tasks, like, for example, a gaze queuing task, in more complex experimental routines that include as well interactive aspects. To introduce this topic, I want to talk to you about another experiment I've been doing in the last few years. This is published in Journal of Experimental Psychology General in 2016. Again, this is just a computerized based task, actually pretty similar to the group queuing procedure I described before. The beginning, this experiment was divided in a learning phase and a test phase. In the learning phase of this experiment, participants were exposed to this type of trial procedure. 3 phases appear on the screen, and they're looking at the central object in front of them. Then 1 phase, in this example, the blonde phase, shifts their gaze towards a particular object, and she is immediately followed by the other 2 phases. In this experiment, the 3 phases could always look in the same direction, but importantly, 1 phase always moved first, leading the group gaze, and the remaining 2 group members always followed their gaze. And then again, the target appeared, the participants were instructed to ignore the gaze shifts and just respond to the target as quickly as possible with a button press. Participants went through this procedure, this trial many times, like 20 minutes of this learning phase. Critically here, let me repeat it, participants had the opportunity to learn that a face identity, a stimulus face, like for example the blonde lady in this example, was always leading the group gaze, and other faces never lead the group gaze. Then they went through, after 5 minutes from the learning phase, they went through the test phase, that is a standard gaze cueing task with just a face presented. Again, the face shifts the gaze towards left or right, and the response target appears. Critically here, in the test phase, participants re-encountered the same face stimuli of the learning phase. And particularly they encountered the group leaders, so the faces that consistently led the group gaze and the learning phase, and the group non-leaders, or the followers, let's say. Here, the analysis of reaction times showed very clearly that the magnitude of gaze following in response to leader identities was much larger than the magnitude of gaze following in response to non-leader phases. That is, the participants followed more quickly, to a greater extent, the gaze direction of group leaders relative to the gaze direction of group followers or non-leaders. Per se, this was not particularly new in the literature, because literature in social cognition has started to emphasize a few years ago that gaze following is modulated by the identity you encounter. For example, you tend to follow the gaze direction, more the gaze direction of people you believe you recognize as having high social status, more leader-like, or just more reliable, or more trustable, more competent. However, this was the first time that I was able to show for the first time a direct connection between the observation of a group interaction and subsequent gaze following responses to group members. Now, in our journey towards natural group interactions, we could ask, for example, if this same paradigm or a very similar paradigm can be adapted to integrate a more interactive component. In other words, what happens to the gaze cueing if to the test phase, the gaze cueing in the test phase, if it is preceded by a real group interaction instead of a computerized, simplified group interaction, like in this case. Well, this is exactly what we've done a couple of years ago. The paradigm would look like more or less like this. Participants would interact, for example, in groups of 3 in a group interaction, and then they would go under, they would be administered the gaze following task. Critically here, the phases that are used as stimuli in the gaze following task and the gaze cueing procedure would be the phases of, for each participant would be the phases of their fellow group members. So I will break the procedure down a little bit more, but here the thing is that these methods were very interesting to implement, because the experimental routine is pretty complex. So participants, at participants' arrival, we took their pictures, and while they were interacting with one of the experimenters, the other experimenter was adapting with Photoshop the pictures to then implement them in the gaze cueing task. Importantly here, we also recorded group members' looking behaviors using what we would call spy glasses. They're a cheap alternative to eye tracking. Basically, they're glasses that look like prescription glasses, but they hold a camera in the screen in the center. This camera records a video, and then we extracted some measures of gaze behaviors that I will describe in much more detail later. We extracted these group gaze behaviors from these videos. I hope I didn't forget any relevant information here, but let's see a little bit this design a little bit more. So we had the 13 person groups of the same gender. I tend not to study mixed gender groups because they have entirely different social dynamics. Participants during their interaction were administered a survival task. It's a popular task. It's often used in social psychology literature that basically presents participants with a dramatic survival scenario, like you're stranded on an island, and asks participants to rank 12 everyday objects like a rare mirror or chocolate bar in order of importance for their survival. It's just a task, a very engaging task to have them interact on something. while they're having this survival task during the group interaction, again, they were wearing these spy glasses to record their gaze. Immediately after the group interaction, they were administered a leadership perception questionnaire because we wanted to see whether we could connect group gaze behavior with the leadership perception that each individual had of other group members. It's a very brief questionnaire, and if you want, I can give more details about all these methods later. And importantly, after 5 minutes, they went through the gaze cueing task, again with the faces of their fellow group members used as stimuli. Here, the central question for us would be, group gaze behavior, does it relate to leadership perception among group members? And if so, can then predict how the gaze, the magnitude of gaze following that each group member elicits in their fellow group members. Based, of course, on my previous research, you would hypothesize that yes, the more one behaves as a leader during a group interaction, the more gaze following they should elicit in subsequent tests. But now the interesting question, and remember that I was one of the first researchers to start this type of questions, so I also had to establish the methods to investigate gaze dynamics during group interactions. So what is that we measure when we measure group gaze dynamics during group interactions? Well, true that these measures were never applied in group settings, but previous literature, cognitive and social psychology literature, had some suggestion on which I based to create a taxonomy to describe group gaze dynamics. First of all, we start with the social referencing. Social referencing is how long each group member is looked at by the other group members without looking back. This behavior is typical in, for example, also in mother-infant interactions, and signals how much an individual is entrusted with competence or authority. The more you looked at during a social interaction, typically the more you are entrusted with the competence or authority. Then we have, along similar lines, what we would call participation, that is how long each individual member looked at other group members without being looked at. We would say that this signals the level of involvement in the group dynamics. For example, the more you look at your fellow group members, the more you are engaged in the interaction. Then finally, of course, we have mutual gaze, that is how long a group member was looking at another group member while simultaneously looked back. Again, from previous literature, we can say that mutual gaze indexes cooperation, communicative effort. Importantly, according to previous literature, these three indices would all relate to leadership perception. That it was a question relevant in the context of our study. Specifically, based on previous literature, we could hypothesize that social referencing would be positively related to leadership perception. The more you are perceived as a leader, the more you're looked at during a group interaction. Participation would have a negative relationship because leaders tend to be more detached during group interaction, less involved. So the more you perceive the leader as a leader, the less you should look at others. And mutual gaze, again, a positive relation, such that leaders tend to engage in more episodes of mutual gaze. Therefore, the more you're perceived as a leader, the more you should have, you should be involved in mutual gaze episodes. Let's see the first bits of the results that confirmed our predictions. Again, consistent with literature, the more you're perceived as a leader, the more you're looked at. So positive relationship between social referencing and leadership assessment. Again, leadership assessment was a questionnaire that we administered after the group interaction. Negative relationship with the participation. The more you're perceived as a leader, the less you look at other people. And the positive relationship with mutual gaze. The more you're perceived as a leader, the more often and the longer you engage in mutual gaze episodes. But now the interesting question is that whether these group gaze behaviors, that is, these implicit dynamics somehow relating to social perception and leadership assessment, as these slides show, can also predict subsequent gaze following. In other words, individual members' levels of social referencing, participation, and mutual gaze can predict the magnitude of gaze following that these individuals elicit in their fellow group members in subsequent encounters. To answer this question, as you can imagine, I put into regression these indices and the magnitude of gaze following that each individual elicited in their fellow group members. And the preliminary results show that the best predictor of gaze following is social referencing. The more you looked at during a group interaction, the more your gaze will be then followed in subsequent encounters with your group members. This result is very interesting because it says many things about the specific role of social referencing during social interactions, and we can definitely talk more about it. But more in general, I think that the important take-home message from the second part of the talk is that, or this specific study, is that we can move towards more interactive scenarios by integrating natural group interactions with lab-based computerized tasks and get in this way fundamental information on how social interactions, group interactions specifically, can influence subsequent individual cognition on other tests, in other encounters. And in many ways, this might be an important tool to relate social processes, social contagion processes, to subsequent individual behaviors. So let me sum up on this second part of the talk. Social attention appears to relate reliably to social perceptions and specifically to perceptions of leadership of group members. Social referencing in particular, that is how long a group member is looked at by their fellow group members, predicts subsequent gaze following. And again, let me emphasize once again that these might be important tools to relate experimentally group natural dynamics with individual behaviors. What about interactive group dynamics? Now, a different question. If in the second part of the talk I've been describing ways in which we can relate group dynamics to subsequent individual behaviors, now I want to ask if we can continue our journey towards these predictions in natural group dynamics by asking whether group-based behaviors can tell us something more specific about the social dynamics going on during a group interaction. The answer is yes. I want to anticipate the answer, and the way in which I tested this question was a much more complex design. It has been published in 2019, where in iScience, where I wanted to move forward the correlational approach I've shown in the previous study and apply a more strictly predictive approach to the study of gaze behavior during group interactions. The way in which I've done this was with four-person group interactions. I will describe the methods a little bit later, but again, as an alternative to eye tracking, because at the time we didn't have 4 mobile eye trackers to use, we started a collaboration with computer scientists that have developed algorithms to automatically recognize human heads in videos and automatically track their movements. Specifically, in this experimental setup, we had 4 cameras, one for each individual, recording the upper part of their bodies, like shoulders and head, and After the interaction on the videos of these cameras, our collaborators, computer scientists, applied the super vector machine algorithms to automatically track heads. And in this way, again, as an alternative to eye tracking, in this way approximating looking behaviors based on head movements. Here the group interactions were again 4-person groups, again of the same gender, again a survival task. But importantly, in this scenario, we had this designated roles to the group members. Each group was composed by a leader and 3 followers. All participants knew that there was a leader, who the leader was. The leaders were selected with the pre-sampling strategy. Before a few months before the experiment, we administered personality questionnaires to a large cohort of people, like 300 people, and based on the results of these questionnaires, we selected 16 leaders and randomly assigned all other people to the groups as followers. Again, everyone knew that there was a leader, who the leader was, and that the decision would, so that everyone should contribute, every group member should contribute to the decision, but then they would help, in fact, the leader to make the decision, because the leader was responsible on the final decision on the survival task. Here the main question was, can group gaze behavior, that is where group members are looking at, for how long, so on and so forth, like the indices I described before, can reveal who the group leader is. Can we identify a leader in a group only based on group gaze behaviors? To answer this question, that is in fact a classification question, we used again a super vector machine approach. A super vector machine is just a classification algorithm that given n classes, in this case leader follower, is fed with some information, in our case like group gaze behaviors, and specifically the indices I've been mentioning before, social referencing, participation, and mutual gaze. And the question is that whether the SVM can predict the class of a given individual just based on group gaze, on looking behaviors, for example, based on how long an individual was looked at or was looking at someone, or engaged in mutual gaze. Just based on this information, can the algorithm, the classification algorithm, predict whether, guess whether an individual is a leader or a follower? Importantly, all SVM approaches and classification algorithms work based on a training task procedure. That is, they're trained based on the information they have, they're trained on a subset of the data, and then they're tested on a new subset of the data that they never encountered. This is a true prediction, this is pure prediction, because the idea here is that then at that point, a well-trained algorithm, if the information given to the algorithm is relevant to the classes, then a well-trained algorithm should predict any kind of new scenario that is similar to the one that is proposed. Again, true prediction. The idea is to predict the classes of data that the algorithm doesn't know yet. The information that we gave to the SVM, as you can imagine, and as I mentioned before, was based on the 3 indices I've been describing earlier: participation, social referencing, and mutual gaze. However, you can also break them down a little bit more. For example, in the context of a group of people, of a group of 4, you can also make a difference of when a person was looked at by a single member or by multiple members simultaneously. And mutual gaze can be broken down also in terms of how many episodes of mutual gaze did an individual start, and how long it took the other person to react to these mutual gaze initiations. Again, these were the variables we used, and there are at least 8 features, in total 8 features that we gave to the SVM to make its predictions. And here are the results. So as you can see on the bar graph on the left, the algorithm predicted the leader-follower classification with an accuracy that was above the 80% and certainly above the 50% chance level. On the right, you can see the confusion matrix that basically shows the data in terms of false positive and false negatives. Darker gray areas indicate higher accuracy, and you can see that it does very well with the classification of followers, the darkest area, and still pretty well with the identification of leaders. Here you can see the individual contribution of each feature, of each variable, of each one of the variables we included. They're ordered from the highest to the lowest importance, and you can see that looking at participation does pretty well. Looked at social referencing does well too, and mutual gaze lower but not that bad. Importantly, if you look at the means on the right of this table, you can see that the direction of these features is exactly the one we saw in the previous study with the correlational approach, meaning that the less you're looked at during a group interaction, so the less the levels of participation you have, the more likely you will be selected as a leader. But on the contrary, as we were seeing before, the more you looked at or the more you engage in mutual gaze, so higher levels of social referencing and mutual gaze are associated with the higher likelihood of being classified as a leader instead of a follower. Again, we conceptually replicated the findings of the previous study, but we move forward in terms of predictions, of predictive power. Group-based behaviors can identify group leaders, can therefore predict social group dynamics. I want to close up on this last part of my talk saying tracking multi-party gaze features is a challenge, especially when you move from 3 to 4. Many things have to be taken into account, including finding creative, sometimes ways to tracking the eye movements. Collaborations with other scientists and creative solutions might be needed to answer this challenge. However, we can see that group-based behaviors reflect social dynamics accurately, and that these dynamics can be used. The predictive power of these dynamics is pretty high because it can be used to identify group leaders during natural group interactions. Okay, now I'm the last couple of slides of this talk, and I just want to sum up on what I've said today overall. Social attention and possibly social cognition in general change sometimes dramatically from dynamic to multi-agent settings, and I believe this is my main topic of research, my main area of research, but I believe that social cognition has still many questions to answer in this direction, and I hope that this will be an important part of the future steps of my area. My research shows at least that at the very least we have sophisticated and often interacting heuristics that support our navigation of complex social settings, that allow us to determine the social relevance of the stimuli we encounter and to not get lost following all the social cues and all the social information we encounter. And finally, when it comes to real group interactions, social attention can index reliably the implicit semantics, the implicit social dynamics of groups, like, for example, leadership dynamics, and can be used to predict both group roles and individual behaviors. Again, hopefully these are valuable methods that can be used together with other areas in in psychology, for example, social psychology, organizational psychology, so on and so forth, to add the study of nonverbal dynamics to the study of social processes. Finally, last slide, I swear, I will give you this presentation, I will give you these slides, and I hope you can share and find it useful. On the last slide, I wanted to list a few methods you can definitely use. R scripts for machine learning approaches are there is an R package called PredPsych, written by Atish Kohl. He's a friend of mine. He's a great person. He wrote this package in R to use machine learning approaches in cognitive psychology, and wrote 2 papers to explain how this package works. You can find the datasets and codes of the last study I presented, the one with the 4 people interacting, by contacting at the link here, the Pattern Analysis, Computer Vision at the Italian Institute of Technology. You have to fill a form and then you can get these videos. And there's something I did not mention, but I did use in some of my studies is nonlinear analysis. That are various nonlinear tools to analyze complex patterns of data in more sophisticated and complex ways. You can here refer to the tools created, the MATLAB tools created by Professor Richardson that made them available on his website. I am done for today. I will stop sharing the presentation. Hopefully everything went well and you heard me well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Francesca. It was a very interesting topic and very useful. I have a lot of questions of myself that I'm going to ask you. But first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity of sharing your experience and your knowledge and your research that you have done in this area that I think is very important in so many areas, not only in the leadership, but also in the organization, in the education kind of setup. So I think there are a lot of stuff. So let me start with some questions that they sent before. There are some studies, they asking if there are some studies about the influence that the feelings and emotions can have also in these gaze dynamics, not only the visual or the where the places where the other also the feelings or the emotion that could be involved in these gaze dynamics.
That's an excellent question. Again, my area, social attention, is moving just now, the very first steps to investigate natural dynamics, like natural social interactions. There is, so in the first steps, I think that emotions are still too complex, too complicated to study. We're still too far from there. Emotions are very complicated to study from the cognitive point of view in any case. There is some research more in dyadic settings, so that is one-on-one interactions that are trying to see whether the emotional involvement or the emotional state we perceive in the other person modulates these dynamics. But to give you more specific paper suggestions, I should look into them. So maybe you can shoot me an email and I can update you. When it comes to gaze cueing, emotions are involved, especially the emotion of the face. Basically what happens is that in some circumstances, so if you have reasons to believe that the other face is signaling with a fearful expression, it's signaling a threat, you follow their gaze more, because at that point, it's a survival. It's probably an evolutionary mechanism that emphasizes the importance of the gaze of someone else. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Here's a comment that they thank you. Excellent topic explained by you. So Carmen sent this.
You're too kind.
The other question that I have is, what happens in an organization with, I don't know, you put in front of each other the tables where they work, I don't know, maybe their place of work, and they can see each other working, and I don't know, the dynamic that is involved in the workplace. Could this work that you have done be applied and be, I don't know, maybe can help in order to construct a better dynamic in the workplace if you see each other working, I don't know, maybe following the same dynamics of this activity?
That's an interesting question. So I mainly deal with leadership dynamics. So far, I've mainly dealt with leadership dynamics. My prediction would be that in a situation like that, so everyone is working in a group, still the one who is perceived as the most leader-like, they would be looked at more, because that's something I've been observing very often. Whether, though, for example, it's interesting to ask whether stimulating a more mutual gaze would stimulate more cooperative behaviors. I think that's a very excellent question for future research on how we can, if and how we can work on nonverbal group dynamics, for example, working on mutual gaze and reciprocal sharing. Can these influence the social dynamics with which we work together? That's an excellent question. My guess would be yes, but I'm biased because I I study these things.
Yeah, I know. I have another question here. I'm going to try to translate it because it's in Spanish, but if you evaluate the 64 participants and they were chosen the leaders, or is just the evaluation of 16 person with the profile of a leader and included the 16 groups?
I didn't understand the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Maybe I can put it and I can send it to you, and you can give us the later.
Yeah. So, but let me try to explain the procedure that I used.
Yes.
So maybe I answered the question even if I didn't understand it. So what happened is that we had 300 people having these filling out this personality questionnaire that is the SIMLog, it's called. And again, I can give you these details later on by email. So this questionnaire returns how you tend to be an effective leader, and which style you tend to use. For example, you tend to be a good leader but more democratic, or a good leader but more autocratic. Okay, because in this, I didn't explain it, but in this design we also made this difference between democratic and autocratic leaders. Then we selected the highest quartile of these leadership attitudes with a procedure that again is explained in the paper in any case. And within this highest quartile, we selected randomly 16 people. So these were our 16 leaders. All the remaining ones were randomly chosen as followers.
Okay.
So they were paired in this way. And if this doesn't answer the question, shoot me an email.
I think it does. And another question is, what happened if the group has two the leaders?
That's my future. I'm asking myself this question since a while now. One thing I'd like to explore, for example, is what happens when the designated leader doesn't have a leader personality. Well, for example, it can happen that in a company, the person who became the boss is not that smart or competent. It can happen. What if in the same group, the designated leader, there is a person who is more naturally a leader? So would the gaze behavior be able to identify, the designated leader or the actual natural leader? That's a question I will ask in the next few years. Absolutely. I want to know the answer.
Perfect. Another comment from Rocio is that thank you very much for the conference. It was impeccable. And thank you very much. And I have two final questions also. What happened, for example, in this new reality that we are going to live, that maybe some places are going to put these barriers between the people? What could happen in the gaze dynamic if they can see from each other?
If they cannot see, that's an excellent question. The answer is not there. Put it simply, not only for leadership dynamics, but also for any kind of other approach. So when let's make an example. When Skype came up, we had no idea of how this would impact our social cognitive processes. Now there are studies that are informing us how they change, how Skype changes our cognitive interactions, how it doesn't. So it's very hard to predict. what alternatives we will use to communicate non-verbally if we can't use gaze, because gaze
Yeah.
is so important. The very fact that we tend to look into each other's eyes while we talk, even through Skype, signals that eye contact, mutual gaze, is a very powerful tool to establish cooperation and communication. Without that, I simply don't know the answer. I'm optimistic. I know that we will adapt as human beings. We adapt. Our cognitive system adapts to any challenge. How? I honestly can't predict. I don't know. I don't take the risk. I don't bet.
Perfect. And my final question is: you say in your work you found that the best way is the social. I don't remember how you call it, but notice the in front when they have a mutual contact, but they only see the face of the other one, and a lot of people are looking at this person. But what happened with the leadership that looks at all the people? Because I was thinking maybe that the leader is maybe more involved, more empathic about the personnel and the workers that he see or she see each other. But in your results, just say that it's
The
not.
contrary.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, this was surprising to me as well. So don't forget though that I kept separated the participation, so the time an individual looked at others, and mutual gaze. So when there was this, I'm looking at you and you're looking at me, reciprocal exchange. This is important because it's true that leaders tend to look at others the less, but they also engage more in mutual gaze. So this suggests to me that when they look at, it's not that they don't look at others, they look at others, but they more in mutual gaze episodes than in, without being responded.
okay.
You know where I'm trying to go?
Yeah, yeah,
So when it comes to participation per se, so how long each individual looked at others, leaders are low in that because they don't look at others that much outside of mutual gaze episodes. Maybe they're looking at somewhere else, they're thinking, they're pretty
yeah, yeah.
detached.
Okay.
But they are involved more in mutual gaze episodes, meaning that when they engage in the conversation, they engage reciprocally. And that's an interesting thing to keep in mind.
Okay, perfect, perfect. Once again, Francesca, thank you very much for this amazing talk. I think it's
Thank you.
very interesting. And I would like to ask you if you can send a final message for most of the people that are watching these videos are students from the Department of Psychology that maybe are interested involved in this kind of research. What is your final message, the thing that they need to know in order to start doing research in this area?
Can I say something that is non-scientific?
Yeah, sure, sure.
Embrace the challenge. If I didn't embrace the challenge when I started in 2012, where these methods didn't even exist, I would not be here. Embrace the challenge and do it with enthusiasm and, bravedom sometimes. That's it. This enthusiasm will take you a long way. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Francesca. I hope you have a good time here with us.
I love this opportunity. Thank you very much. You're very kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much to all the people that were tuned to this seminar. So, we are going to continue with following activities. So, stay tuned for the webpage. We have surprises and a lot of new activities. So, thank you very much. Now, I am closing the transmission in YouTube, but I stay with a little bit longer with Francesca and Jitsi. So, take care and good day and be safe.